Welcome to the Punishment in Society Digital Speaker Series. Punishment in Society is a collaborative research network, or CRN, of the Law and Society Association. You can find past DSS talks on our website. Today, we hear from Justin Iverson, who is a research librarian and assistant professor of law at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas's William S. Boyd School of Law. He will be discussing cops or coaches, the statutory role of juvenile probation officers in a transformative age. At the end of the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. You can put your question or name in the chat at any time to get a queue going, or you can raise your virtual hand during the Q&A after the talk. As a reminder, we are recording this session, so if you do not want to be on camera, please feel free to post your question in the chat. Before I turn it over to Justin, I want to announce that our next installment of the Digital Speaker Series will be on Thursday, May 10th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time and feature Adriana Romero Sanchez from the University of Wisconsin presenting Peace Without Impunity, Narratives of Punishment in the Context of the FARC's Transitional Justice System in Colombia. With that, I turn it over to you, Justin.
Great. Thanks for the intro, Ashley, and thank you to all of you for being here. I'm going to share my screen here. And everyone can see the slides, right? Great. So before I get started, I just wanted to give a quick disclaimer that this paper is not written by me alone. This was written in conjunction with David Tannenhouse, who is in the audience and I think hoping to be just an observer today. So I'll handle the presentation and the questions, but just know that this is not a solo endeavor, and I very much appreciate David's knowledge and expertise in co-authoring. So I have presented this research now to a law faculty audience and to a law student audience, and I received great feedback in those spaces. So my hope here is that I'll receive different feedback in this talk that will further the sorts of interdisciplinary scholarship that we're all kind of working towards these days. As Ashley mentioned, this paper is titled Cops or Coaches, the Statutory Role of Juvenile Probation Officers in a Transformative Age. And what that means is there's a component of juvenile justice reform that is not discussed enough or in detail, which is the actual state laws that are in place. As many of you probably know, since the late 1990s, the rate of juvenile incarceration in the US has actually decreased by more than 50%. But at the same time, racial inequities in the juvenile justice system have worsened. Beginning in 2005, youth advocates won a series of US Supreme Court cases. In those decisions, the court drew on adolescent development research to place limits on the most severe sentences for juvenile offenders who were prosecuted as adults in the criminal system. This included abolishing the juvenile death penalty in Roper, life without the possibility of parole for non-homicidal offenses in Graham v. Florida. And the court also abolished mandatory life without the possibility of parole for minors in Miller v. Alabama. Recently, juvenile justice experts and organizations such as the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges have called for using this adolescent development research to transform the work that juvenile probation officers are doing. So instead of serving primarily as agents of state surveillance who arrest adolescents for violating conditions of probation, these reformers and organizations are calling for juvenile probation officers to act more like life coaches or counselors instead of cops, hence the title of our presentation here. So on this slide, you see an image from a Casey Foundation publication, championing the role for the juvenile probation officer. This new vision is part of a larger attempt to limit the number of children who are detained or incarcerated and to begin to address racial inequities at the front end of the system. The first part of our paper proceeds along this route, tracing the history of the transformation of the juvenile probation officer from an unpaid volunteer in the early 20th century to the salaried professional that it is today. On this slide, we have a contrast showing Ida B. Wells, who served as a volunteer juvenile probation officer in Chicago, with a photo that is currently being used to recruit juvenile probation officers. There are now between 15 and 20,000 juvenile probation officers in the United States. Collectively, states spend more than $2 billion annually, $2 billion annually to operate juvenile probation systems. As part of our historical overview of the changing role of the juvenile probation officer, we highlight the case of Fair v. Michael C. For those of you who don't know, in 1978, the California Supreme Court held that a juvenile during a custodial interrogation asking for his probation officer was analogous to a child asking for a parent, which was tantamount to an adult asking for a lawyer. As the court explained, by quote, "By so holding, we recognize the role of the probation officer as a trusted guardian figure who exercises the authority of the state as parens patriae and whose duty is to implement the protective and rehabilitative powers of the juvenile court." The only problem is that the US Supreme Court disagreed with that interpretation. The justices pointed out that California legally defined by statute juvenile probation officers as peace officers. And from their perspective, California statutes effectively made juvenile probation officers into agents of law enforcement rather than a child's trusted guardian. As Justice Blackmun explained, he owes an obligation to the state, notwithstanding the obligation he may also owe the juvenile under his supervision. In most cases, the probation officer is duty-bound to report wrongdoing by the juvenile when it comes to his attention, even if the communication is from the juvenile himself. Since that time, the role of juvenile probation officers has fluctuated between that of more of a social worker and that of more of a police officer. And by the mid-1980s, one study of juvenile probation officers revealed that the majority saw law enforcement as their primary responsibility. This perspective is aligned with the get tough on crime changes in our political culture and the super predator scare. Our article asks two questions, which you'll see on this slide, about whether you can or you should try to change the role of the juvenile probation officer without first changing their legal status. So now we're getting into the data, which is our original research in this space. Are juvenile probation officers considered peace officers? We thought this would be a really simple question. We thought that this would not take much time at all. But when we actually dug into the research on this, we were finding answers that, frankly, were impossible to verify. We were seeing charts and data and analysis that completely omitted the statutory component. And so we had to take it on good faith, which didn't feel quite right, especially with how quickly the juvenile probation officer or juvenile probation space is changing these days. So we decided that this was going to require original research by digging into the statutes. And so we identified four main areas of consideration when trying to identify whether a state considers their juvenile probation officers to be peace officers. The first category, peace officer status, is does the state literally just say, you know, you are a probation officer, or you are a peace officer, or you are not? And then in the absence of that clear expression, we thought of other factors that might illuminate the answer. So who employs these juvenile probation officers? What department, what branch? Who has the power over them? Who makes decisions? And then the power to arrest. We, in our minds, and the research sort of verifies this, that if you are legally allowed to arrest minors, that speaks to more of a police power, right, than a counselor or a coach. And then authority to carry firearms, perhaps the most visible difference between peace officers and non. So turning to the question of peace officer status, we have our first chart. You'll see there are some bullet points to consider. Many jurisdictions clearly define who qualifies as a peace officer, while others either have no definition in statute or there are implications one way or another. Doubtless, there are states that just simply haven't grappled with the concept of this role, but more commonly, perhaps, is that it remains a relatively young profession. and thus it's subject to fast-changing industry norms. Looking at the chart, you'll see there are 7 states where juvenile probation officers are clearly considered peace officers, and 9 where they clearly are not, which only answers about a third of the country. The remaining 2/3 of states have some degrees of ambiguity. We've noted that about 40% of states, meaning the likely no category, do not consider their folks to be peace officers. And in additional 13, they're what we're calling a limited yes. And that's sort of a likely yes, but also it's limited intentionally, it seems. States use the terms, peace officer powers, peace officer authority, peace officer capacity. There are these situational delegations of power rather than writ large delegation as peace officers. So when we try to create sort of a pattern of what's happening around the country, it seems like it's about 40% of states probably they're peace officers, and about 60% where they're probably not. Turning to employment, there are these 3 blocks of colors. So you see the orange states, which are about half at 25 states, that the judicial branch is the hiring entity for juvenile probation officers. 17 are in the executive and 8 are a hybrid combination. The individual delegations between the judicial breakdowns don't seem to be that important, really. But when you look at the executive branch, you start to see things that are more indicative. So, for example, if 7 states delegate hiring authority to the Family and Social Services Department, that speaks to more of a counselor-esque role. If 7 delegate that role to the criminal or juvenile system, or to corrections with 3 states, that seems to be more of a cop orientation. On the next slide, we are talking about the power to arrest. So as you can see, 15 states clearly provide that juvenile probation officers may make arrests. And in 8, they clearly may not. Among the remaining 27 states, we do have a considerable amount of factor weighing. Many states do not use the words arrest or the words of arrest or similar. Instead, they allow juvenile probation officers to take juveniles into temporary custody. In Idaho, as one example, the legislature expressly stated that when minors are taken into custody, it may not be considered an arrest. There is little discussion in statutes, obviously, for why this discrepancy or this nuance is in place. But we can imagine scenarios in which an arrest record could harm children in their transition to adulthood and beyond. So that starts to paint a different picture of the power to arrest and really the importance of dissecting it in meaningful ways. In the largest category on this chart, you'll see 18 states that likely do not give arresting power to juvenile probation officers. There are many reasons for this ambiguity and why there are so many states in a likely no pattern. But in our paper, we included a parenthetical in the footnote explaining the exact reasons for our doubts. We found that our paper's primary contribution is actually the heavy footnoting, the actual designation of statutes that people can go and they can look for themselves. And that makes this sort of a research, a paper about research, in addition to being a paper with some actual answers. The ambiguity largely falls into the areas of statutory silence. The statutes just simply don't speak to the power to arrest, or there are duties listed that align with more of a counseling role or more of an enforcement role, which gets us that divide between likely no and likely yes. There was one state that was just entirely unclear. We couldn't even make a judgment call on it. But again, the paper's strength is that we present the data directly so that others can make their own decisions about that. So the final 9, or the final category is the authority to carry firearms. And I've included a direct quote here from the U.S. Courts Probation and Pretrial Services Department. And if you read through this quote, it becomes clear that it's very much a jurisdiction by jurisdiction decision of whether juvenile probation officers can carry firearms. And even within those jurisdictions, it's often up to the individual officers themselves. As the probation department explains, some federal probation officers do carry firearms, some do not. For some officers at the state and local level, carrying firearms is optional. For others, it's mandatory. And for still others, it's not allowed at all. So our research found that there were 15 jurisdictions, 15 states, where juvenile probation officers were allowed to carry firearms. That's not a mandate. We did not find any states that by statute require them to carry firearms, and only 6 states expressly forbid it by statute. The ambiguity in this research is significant, more so than other categories. And the reason for that is simply that this authority to carry firearms is often a departmental policy, more so than state law. There's also considerable ambiguity about the kinds of training that juvenile probation officers are required to undergo. In many states, there's a post-academy, and in some of those states, it's not clear whether juvenile probation officers are required to go. To get a really specific answer on whether a particular jurisdiction authorizes carrying of firearms, it then becomes necessary to contact the department themselves and see if you can obtain a policy document, which is outside the scope of the research we were doing here, which is purely on what do the statutes say. With our analysis complete, the next slide turns to our call to action. In this call, we are encouraging reformers of the juvenile justice system to consider statutes within their broader reform goals. We argue that reformers should consider the relevant statutes in their jurisdiction that they wish to influence, and that they pay attention to duties where the statutes live within a statutory scheme, whether these statutes are scattered or they're cohesive, and whether they should be the reverse. What are the titles of these employees? Who employs them? What powers do they have? What duties? Are there any limitations in place? And in what ways does discretion reside with juvenile probation officers or their directors or others? This is intentionally broad. There are large differences from state to state, but we thought it was important to think about, let's say, for example, the statutory scheme. Many states don't separate out a distinction between an adult probation officer and a juvenile probation officer, which, if any of you have been involved in those spaces, they're different work, right? And in those states where there's only a description of a probation officer, those states tend to lean more towards peace officer status and peace officer powers. So if we don't separate out the role of an adult probation officer and a juvenile probation officer, it's going to slant towards an enforcement angle rather than towards the coaches or counselor role that many people are envisioning these days. In another example, are there any special powers that they have? So in one state, there are adult probation officers, juvenile probation officers, and then there's a unit called a specialized juvenile probation officer. And this specific group created by statute of specialized officers are juvenile probation officers who are explicitly peace officers. They wear body armor, they carry guns and bulletproof vests and all that sort of thing. So, it's important to see what the statutes are doing. That's not to say these types of juvenile probation officers don't exist in other jurisdictions. It's just that by statute, only one state makes that clear. And so reformers should consider what they want their state laws to say. In conclusion, we believe it's important to balance the goals of juvenile probation and learn lessons from other states. We do not, in this paper, propose a one-size-fits-all regime or seek to impose any particular solution on states. other than we consider it essential to determine the role for juvenile probation officers within statutes, or at least to consider that role. And so that is the end of my formal presentation. I'm happy to take questions. There are more considerations at play that I'm happy to discuss, but I want to just kind of see where the conversation is going because I'm happy to learn from you all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that great talk. So please join me in offering a virtual round of applause. Yay. So we have some time for questions. As a reminder, we are recording. So if you don't want to be on camera, please feel free to post your question in the chat. I'll pull up my chat now. And while people are kind of ruminating and thinking about their questions and coming up with the right way to ask it, which is always so stressful, I'm going to go ahead. Oh, wait, sorry, we already have a question. Spence, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for this fascinating research. I mean, it's really great to hear about. I have kind of two questions that I think follow on from one another. One is about geography, because I suppose I was sort of expecting to see, a big color-coded map of the different states. And so was wondering whether in kind of trying to give an overview of this data, you notice geographic patterns about states in different regions tending to go one way or the other. And then the second part of the question, because I realized that might actually be very difficult to create one map if the different indicators go different ways. And so I was wondering, when you look across your 4 criteria, how often does it, how much overlap is there where you say, here's a given state, and of the 4 indicators, how many point in one direction versus the other? Is there usually a lot of agreement? Is there not? Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Spence. So we did not try to answer every question in this paper. So we presented the data, and there's a chart at the end of the paper that I am going to pull up and share screen in just a minute. That shows, for example, it'll say Alabama, and then it'll be the 4 boxes of our analysis. And so you can see what a given state is doing. So others could compile this data, or we could in a future paper if someone hasn't done it in advance. But the only real geographic analysis that we did was sort of informal, and it was the employment context. And so what we noticed is that juvenile probation sort of began in like Chicago and in the Northeast. And so states in the Northeast, in the smaller, physically smaller states, tended to have like statewide juvenile probation systems. And so there's more state exercise of control over the juvenile probation profession. And then once you get out towards the Western states, which are geographically larger, and you have more space between large cities, and you have, counties with tiny populations that cover, a space the size of like New York, you start to see that juvenile probation consolidates to a city or county level. And so in that case, you're giving more power to quote unquote lower level hiring authority and policy decision making, rather than leaving it at the state level, which is more common in the East. And then in terms of, do states tend to point in one direction? Yes. So for example, I live in Nevada. Nevada had beautiful statutes in terms of my research project. They were short statutes, and they were very clear on these questions. And so in Nevada, yes, juvenile probation officers are clearly peace officers. They are allowed to carry firearms. They do have the power to arrest. They do participate in post-training. And so there's like an informal, yeah, we want to be, the friend, but we're able to act in this enforcement capacity. And in other states, there is just clearly no one has ever considered this role because every single point of analysis is completely unclear. So I don't know if that gives you sort of the global answer you were looking at, but that's sort of the extent of the analysis we've done there.
Awesome. Chiara, go ahead.
Hi. This is really fascinating. And I thought the 4 criteria you presented were really interesting. And I just had a thought. I was wondering if you thought not just about hiring or employment as in which department hires them, but also the qualifications of the people being hired. So for example, do they have social work degrees or masters in criminal justice, right? Or social work experience or law enforcement experience? And yeah, I was just wondering if you've thought about that or because that would be fascinating to see if there's variation in that. Or I'm not even sure how you would get the data for that, but yeah.
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, that's I think super important. Anecdotally, I can tell you from just the frantic Googling I did throughout this project that the state job postings tend to emphasize more of the social work psychology requirements, but many states require startlingly little, and actually the salary tends to be quite low, which makes it difficult to attract people who care and also to attract people with relevant qualifications. But these things tend not to be laid out in statutes. So because our project was focusing on state laws, it was not really possible for us to include that as a data point. I think there are organizations that are really tracking that. None of them are, like, the name is not coming to my head right now, but I do believe that is tracked. There could certainly be a project where someone gathered job postings or job descriptions, and that could be really illuminating in space, honestly. But it does tend to be that it's more of that rehabilitation counselor coach sort of role in job application, but in job duties, many times it's more enforcement. And then I'm just going to share screen real quick to show you the chart we're including in the paper. So you'll see, for example, Nevada, which I discussed. So peace officer, yes. Employer, it's a hybrid situation, and the section of the paper discusses why it's considered a hybrid. The power to arrest, yes. Firearms, allowed. And so every state's kind of tracked that way. Yeah, Fergus?
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed the paper too. Picking up on the last point about training, just as an observation, there's a bit of work in Europe on that question. Quite a lot of work in the UK on training and changes in training arrangements and what they do to the culture and practice of probation. But there's also one study I remember, and I won't remember the details properly, but just so people find it interesting. Our Romanian colleague, Jan Drănescu, did a study which looked at how different qualifications tracked with differences in practice among Romanian probation officers in the establishment of a brand new probation service in the post-Soviet era in his country. And I think I'm probably grossly oversimplifying, but from memory, people that went into that service with law degrees tended to be formal and focused on enforcement and compliance. People who went in with social work degrees tended to do coaching and in the terms that you're using, and people that came in with social science backgrounds, more generic social science backgrounds, were harder to predict, basically. So I always found that a fascinating study and thought there was more to be done with that. I guess it relates to my question, which takes us back to geography. I've also got a faint recollection and very hazy detail on this, but I think Michelle Phelps did a study could even be misremembering if it was Michelle or somebody else, which looked at the spend on rehabilitative activities in American prisons and jails. It might be one or the other. It might be both. I can't remember. Anyway, I remember that I think the analysis tended to show that there was very, very significantly lower rates of spend on rehabilitative activities in the South, generally speaking. And I guess another stage of taking forward the kind of work that you were doing would be to kind of look beyond the statute at other metrics that might help us understand how the role is being realised in practice. So things like looking at the expenditure of juvenile probation budgets and seeing where the expenditure goes might be kind of one really interesting way to track that. But also, I'm fascinated in the kind of historical evolution of how these roles might have developed and changed, both as tracked through legislation, but also again through policy at the state and county level, and policy within the organisations linked to questions like training. I think there'd be so much more digging that we could do to try to kind of fathom whether, again, this is really crude, but whether if probation evolves in the context of a highly racialized project of social control, then it looks a certain way and it gets legislated a certain way. Whereas if it's evolving as part of a child welfare or child saving movement in a different part of the country, it's doing something else. So yeah, just I guess it's a sign of a good paper that it provokes so many other questions about other projects that we might do or that might have been done in the States, and I just don't know of them. But I guess if there's a question here, it's to kind of push you back to the geography and ask you whether, even impressionistically, is it, as you might assume, as a foreigner might assume, that in the South there are more peace officers doing more law enforcement, and as you've kind of suggested in the Northeast, it's looking a bit more social worky, or is that grossly simplistic?
I was surprised by a lot of things in the research as I was, sort of looking at states. California, which is my immediate neighbor in Nevada, we have grossly different statutes, but we largely come to the same outcomes, which is that, it's about enforcement. And I don't know, potentially there's a theory you could make, and there are other states like Colorado, for example, that perhaps there's this Wild West mentality, and that kind of leaked into our statutes about juvenile probation. That, you kind of have to go out and find them, and then you got to bring them in. So no, it didn't present in immediately visceral ways to me. For example, Illinois, which is where Chicago is, has similar statutes. Yes, peace officers. Yes, allowed to carry firearms. Yes, power to arrest. But it began as more of like a helping the children sort of thing. And so to have that cradle of juvenile probation be enforcement focused, I think says something. Our paper does track a little bit with John Augustus, who was sort of like recognized as the first juvenile probation officer who was a volunteer. And even today, there are a lot of volunteer emphasized systems. So, and these tend to be like pilot projects, right? Like if we get volunteers, sort of the way we do like children's attorney projects, if we get volunteers, are they going to care more? But if we're relying on volunteers, can we predict workload and capacity? Can we make sure that we have enough volunteers to operate this system? And of course, operating a volunteer system is not free either. There are costs to doing that because you have to have staff that manage the volunteers. And then you have to hire people when you don't have volunteers. And there are many, many other things that continue to bloat the system. So to sort of answer your question a little more concretely, I guess, if I were to put all four of these data points on a map of the United States, I don't know for certain that we would begin to see patterns, but we won't know unless we try, right? So that's definitely something to consider, I think. And could you say again the name of that Romanian scholar? I didn't catch it.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat because it's easier. He's at the University of Bucharest.
Even better, thank you.
Mhm.
And I should point out that regarding your other question about what's been done in the history in the United States, so my co-author, David Tannenhouse, is like the guy on this. So certainly he could probably point to like 3 of his own articles and 5 of his own books that answer your question directly. But yes, there I think is extensive historical analysis on this.
Yeah.
On the changing role of the juvenile probation officer over time, especially because it's, like I said, not an old profession. It's been monitored the whole way through. And we kind of see, like at the beginning, like around 1905, 1908-ish, these juvenile court statutes and juvenile probation did begin as a statutory entity, which is another reason we selected this as our frame of reference. You start to see those statutes like copy pasted to other jurisdictions or tweaked. And then those tweaks become overhauls and massive shifts. And then you begin to see the diversification. But it's interesting to see that a system that is so young and began as statutes that everyone can see has diversified so dramatically in just 100 or so years.
I should maybe just chip in quickly and say, because my Dutch colleagues are kind of haunting me in my mind as I think about this. They are celebrating 200 years of probation this year, the Dutch, and they claim to be the oldest system in service in the world. So I think there's a World Probation Congress coming up in maybe in November, in somewhere in the Netherlands to celebrate that. So maybe a good place to present.
Awesome. Any other questions? Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So I have lots of thoughts. This was a super stimulating talk. Thank you. So my first thought was just, I was so surprised at the lack of isomorphism. I'm so used to seeing like breakdowns of statutes and seeing them like being pretty similar, like sometimes different on the details, but a lot of times kind of almost copied and pasted. And there are like some areas where we see that not happening. So some of the hate crime legislation, for example, you see like the passage of a hate crime law, but the details, that's where it distinguishes. And there's some really interesting theory by Berthet and Jenis on why we get that kind of divergence instead of the convergence there. So it might be interesting to explore some of those factors. Another thing that was in my mind throughout your talk was the role of legal ambiguity. And I was thinking about this kind of on 2 levels. So on the one hand, a number of the jurisdictions you mentioned, there's basically ambiguity at the level of the statute. So that creates a kind of traditional type of legal ambiguity that, Edelman talks about in her work, or talked about in her work, where that basically creates discretion, and the people who are supposed to be regulated end up basically figuring out, what they want it to look like rather than what the law wants it to look like. On the other hand, you also kind of have legal ambiguity at the level of kind of across the country, in the sense of, I'm so curious what happens when probation officers get together at like national conferences and talk about what national norms should be when they're coming from jurisdictions with very different statutes and very different orientations of what the probation officer is supposed to be, how they're supposed to behave. And so kind of what are the consequences at the professional level for that kind of diversity of the statutes, and to the extent that that seeps through into the orientation of the officers when they do try to establish those professional norms. Do they have a harder time creating nationwide norms? Do some people kind of resist those? Do they go after like majority states in terms of like, the biggest chunks of the pie, those states basically? So I was thinking about kind of legal ambiguity in those 2 ways. And then finally, kind of related to that, I was also wondering about how juvenile probation officers see themselves despite the law. So I'm thinking especially of Mona Lynch's work on, it's like cops or waste disposal managers. I forget if that's the exact title, but it's another one of those kind of like cops or what. And she's talking about how parole and probation officers see themselves as, no, we're law enforcement officers. We're going to use our detective skills. And this was to resist the kind of risk management, managerial, check the box, pee in the cup, do the paperwork, all that stuff. And more, I'm going to use my detective skills because, deep down I'm a cop and I can use my insights here. And so I'm really curious to kind of, like, if you can follow this up with interviews of probation officers around the country to see to what extent do they know about what the statute says. Like, I mean, that's the other thing, is a lot of times we don't even know what the statute says in our own field. So, and then to the extent that they do they resist that at all and kind of say, like, no, like, yes, this says that I'm supposed to, do this, but, deep down, yes, I'm not allowed to carry a gun, but, like, I have one at home, or, I have other means of protecting myself, or just different ways in which they resist it, or maybe do they, have some other reaction to it. So those are kind of my reactions. I'm not really sure if any of those are questions, but if they lead any thoughts, I'm super curious to hear your reactions to my reactions, if that's not super centering myself there.
So I think you just gave me enough content to talk for another 20 minutes, because I every time you got to another point, I was like, oh yeah, I have stuff about that. But I'll try to keep it to 5. So let's see. So kind of work backwards, I think. So how do JPOs see themselves? So actually, conveniently, this week, I was presenting some of this research to Professor Tannenhaus's juvenile justice law students. And the same day, we had guest speakers from one of the county probation departments here in town. So I did get to meet some of these juvenile probation officers and discuss what their job looks like and how they think about themselves. And so you could kind of tell just from them walking in, like, in uniform. It wasn't, like the starched police uniform, right? It's a t-shirt, but it's got like the blue line flag on it and the badge, and like they're in like the cop boots, and they have badges, and so you start to get an identity sense there. But then when you actually talk to them and you ask, how do you do your job? You're in schools all the time. You do truancy. You talk to school resource officers, etc. The conversation is generally like, I try to get on their level. I try to understand who they are, where they're coming from, and let them know that, yeah, like, I have these powers. Here's what if you tell me certain things, I have some duties. If you tell me other things, that's between me and you, so it's really an informal, like, they're still trying to do the coach, mentor, counselor sort of role. They're just empowered in certain ways to act in an enforcement capacity if they're required to, or if if they perceive the need to require that. So their presentation focused more on a rehabilitative scheme, that's how they envision their own role. And they made a lot of time to discuss that their leaders empower them to shape this program to look the way they want it to. So that gets to your discretion question too. But national norms. So there were many states that in their training requirements, when I could find them, mentioned continuing education. And so I just sort of like stumbled into what that looks like. And the trend very much is towards the counselor role. There are not a lot of trainings out there I'm seeing on the enforcement angle. So I definitely think they're going with the reform tide. But if there's a dam on the river, i.e. the statutes, you cannot go further in that direction. So that kind of highlights the importance of really paying attention to what your state laws say and where it gives discretion and where it doesn't. I have definitely lost some of the things that you brought up that I wanted to say, but let's see. Role of legal ambiguity. Yeah, there was certainly a lot of discretion left to the states, and that kind of came up in the authority to carry a firearm conversation. It's, well, you're allowed to. In fact, I think in New York, there was a statute that said something to the effect of juvenile probation officers are not allowed to carry firearms. However, the Second Amendment requires that they be allowed to carry firearms in their personal capacity. So I don't know that anybody thought that needed to be said, but apparently it was important enough to put it in a statute, lest there be any confusion, right? So there are these sort of weird statutes, and potentially there's such an interesting story on that one statute that you could write an entire paper. Because I imagine that had to come about in some really interesting way. But yeah, that's sort of an example of discretion too.
Awesome, thank you. It might be interesting to hook up with Jenny Carlson on her gun research and kind of see like a new intersection of like gun rights and stuff. Let's see, we have a couple of comments and questions in the chat. So further to this point on what happens at the professional level, I was wondering about union membership and where probation officers do or don't belong to police or correctional officer unions.
I honestly did not come across this at all. I have no insights on it. I'm trying to remember if it even came up when I was talking to, I don't know that it came up, but I can make some inferences, which is that the police union in Nevada is statewide. It applies to peace officers, and in this state, peace officers include juvenile probation officers. So therefore, I imagine if they're paying into the same retirement account, they probably have the same union. I know the correctional officers are part of it, so I would imagine the probation officers are as well. Oh, that actually reminded me of something you sort of alluded to, Ashley, which is that when you think about the role of probation officers, it's really a one-size term, but it doesn't fit all. There are some juvenile probation officers who are classified as like intake officers, and so they work primarily in a correctional facility and they don't do a lot of out of the facility work. And when you look at their duties, they tend to look like paperwork. They don't tend to be like a lot of field work in any way. And so sometimes the statutes are really illuminating on what the day-to-day looks like. And also, I didn't discuss this very much, but the paper does make a little bit about titles. So there's intake probation officer, there's probation counselor, there's juvenile probation officer, and again, in some states, the juveniles dropped off and it's one position that does both jobs. There were many more that didn't even include the word officer, but like I'm blanking on the exact listing, but I think we had probably 10 terms for that role, or the analogous role, I guess.
Awesome. And then we have a follow-up. In England and Wales, the trade union grew out of a professional association, the National Association of Probation Officers, which was also active in Scotland and Northern Ireland until our systems diverged more markedly in the 1960s. NAPO still, quote, owns the Probation Journal, now published as a peer-reviewed journal by SAGE, but which began in 1929 as a kind of professional magazine. And anyone interested will also find lots of papers from Europe and elsewhere on these issues in the European Journal of Probation, also published by SAGE. Awesome.
Yeah, that's really helpful info. Thank you.
It's interesting how many journals started off as like, they're like penal reform journals, or like, so there's like the Howard Journal, the Prison Journal, both emerged out of like penal reform organizations. And then the flip side is we also have professional journals and magazines that turn into like they all converged into peer review journals. Any other questions or comments? Oh, one more. Chiara, go for it.
Yeah, I just have a quick question kind of that stems from this discussion of differences across states. And I'm wondering if you've thought about how much difference there could emerge, not just across states, but also across like counties within states, right? And we know that a lot of the justice system in the US is very localized. There are certain norms within court communities, and probation agents are, they are, I'm not sure if this is the same across all states. From what I understand it, or the states I know, that's a state level, the Department of Corrections that kind of manages that. But I guess I'm just wondering, even with a certain state statute, you could have a lot of variation at the local level with different norms amongst the DAs, judges, and yeah, I'm just curious if you've thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And your sense is, I think, 100% accurate that there are huge differences. So I'm using Nevada because it's a very easy state for me to think about. So in Clark County, which is where Las Vegas is, we have something like 2/3 of the state's population in this one county, all in the southern tip. But there are, I believe, 16 other counties, some of them with populations of like 5,000. Spread out across a landmass the size of Rhode Island. And so when you think about juvenile probation in a county of 5,000, there may not even be somebody who does that. Like, it may be outsourced to someone in a different county, and they just like pay that person to come in if they need something, right? So that's in stark contrast to maybe a neighboring county with 3 million people, where there's an entire system and there are 100 juvenile probation officers. And it could be like they rotate, like, oh, it's your turn to go out to that county. I got things to do this weekend, which means they're not as responsive to emergent situations. So absolutely, it looks very different. But when you think about trying to do the actual research of that, it's daunting. Trying to get the laws for the 17 counties in Nevada is, I think, a large project. Trying to get it for all 3,200 counties in the country, it seems impossible. And then when you have to think about the fact that juvenile justice is fast changing, so it could be that like by the time you get to the end, you have to just like go back and verify that nothing's changed. So I don't know what the capability of that would be without employing some sort of large think tank entity with access to like, I don't know, 30 researchers or something. Like, for example, Iowa has, I think, 100 counties. Tennessee is 99. So I do this when I think about it. But I'm sure there is very interesting county by county breakdowns. Like when you look at sort of like the election maps, they're like zooming in and out of states and the counties pop up. I think you would see charts that look like that. And I don't think it would be possible without cooperation from the department. I think you'd have to get department level policies. You'd have to get people willing to go on the record about things. And so it's a different project for sure than this, but certainly illuminating, I think, if you could get the research.
It might be interesting doing a survey approach and just sending out like mailers to the different offices in each county. That'd be
actually, there was a survey like that, now that I remember, 2005, 2006. I think there were 2 editions of it, and it was by the Association of Probation and Parole Officers, and they relied on survey responses. And so they did a little bit of what we do, but again, they cited no statutes. And so when I initially found that survey, I was like, aha, this is going to make my life much easier, and then 0 citations. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'm not preempting, but also, it's not going to make my life as easy as I'd hoped. But yes, that research has been done. I don't believe it was county by county, but I think they did reach out to counties, and they did get some responses.
interesting. So I think we are just about out of time. So please join me in thanking Justin for a great talk. Another virtual round of applause. Yay.